War Between Worlds, Chapter 26, Away Mission. Jen dropped Rook off at the base after their date. It was a little awkward. Neither of them were exactly sure if they should kiss the other. Since neither made the first move, Jen just squeezed his hand before she left. Gwen was slightly disappointed by that when Jen called her. Kevin snorted lightly when Rook called him.
Next time, just kiss her.
That was the Osmosian's advice, and Gwen honestly had a similar idea about the situation. Jen headed to bed and groaned a few hours later when her comm unit began to beep on her bedside table. She pulled herself into a sitting position and answered the call. Somebody better be dying, 'cause if they aren't, I might just kill someone for waking me up. Her grandfather chuckled slightly over the comms.
That'd be why I called you, kiddo. Yeah, we need you to come in.
Jen groaned as she pulled herself out of bed, grumbling as she grabbed her hoodie and grumbled her way into the kitchen. She blinked at the window for a second.
The sun isn't even up yet. I know, but this is life and death. We need you, Jen.
Yeah, I'm on my way. She grumbled her way to her bike and off to the base. Rook was waiting for her in the briefing room with a steaming cup of tea. There was a bag by his feet, and Max handed Jen another. She set it down before she grinned at Rook and accepted the cup he offered. He smiled as she leaned next to him.
All right. This mission is a sensitive one. We received a signal from a downed plumber ship on Terminus 3.
Rook hissed in sympathy, and Jen raised an eyebrow.
It has a toxic atmosphere,
he explained. Jen frowned, sipping her tea. I fail to see how we can help, then, she said, glancing at her grandfather.
It's not immediately toxic, and there is a cure. The venom of the grackle flint neutralizes the toxin, but it has to be fresh.
Jen frowned.
And a grackle flint is a very large feral beast that we need to transport to Terminus 3 within 14 hours if there's any chance of saving those plumbers.
Jen's frown deepened. Why do I feel like there's a catch to this simple-seeming mission?
Max nodded. Because Terminus 3 rests right on the edge of Incursion space, and with the Incursion still pulling back to last year's borders, it's too dangerous to send a plumber ship. We've hired a ship to take you two and the Grackle Flint to Terminus 3 and pick up the stranded plumbers. You'll have to meet up with them in Undertown. Rook's packed his bag and I grabbed you some stuff from your room. You head out immediately.
Jen nodded to Rook, and the two of them headed to Undertown in the proto-truck. They picked up the Grackle Flint first, then headed toward a seedy bar called the Black Hole. Jen waited outside as Diamond Head, standing next to the Grackle Flint's cage. They were pretty valuable, but unpredictable. Rook came back out of the bar, followed by a shorter figure. Jen frowned slightly.
Jen, this is our pilot, Rad Dudesman.
Rook looked a little concerned that this was the case, but Jen just nodded. Captain Dudesman. The duck looked her up and down once, then nodded. Her? I like. Rook frowned as Rad led them off to a nearby hangar. Rook fell into step beside her, still frowning. Jen raised an eyebrow at him. You okay, Blonko? Rook glanced at his partner.
I am concerned that he may not be fully qualified for this mission.
Jen frowned. Why?
He is simply in it for the profit,
Rook stated, frowning as Jen pulled the Grackle Flint into the hold of Rad's ship. The duck's voice popped up from a small balcony overlooking the cargo bay. Profit is my middle name. Jen snorted as she turned back into herself. The Grackle Flint growled and snapped at them, but Jen just rolled her eyes, handing Rook his bag and heading up towards Rad. Hey, sometimes good beings are in it for the profit, Jen stated, and Rook frowned.
You do not seem to find this all that odd.
It sounded almost like a question. Jen shrugged. Oh, this is nothing. The very first time I went out into space, like beyond the solar system, I went by myself, number one. 2, my transport consisted of a mercenary, Tetrax Shard, and his pilot, Gluto, who's a protost. That was weird. Odd things stop being odd after a while when you're around me. Rook nodded. I can see how that would happen. They were interrupted when Rad cleared his throat. We're taking off, but you should know that I only have the one spare cabin. And there's only one bed, so work that out between the two of you. He pointed down the hall to a separate door. The fur on Rook's face puffed up, and Jen went bright red as Rad stepped back into the cockpit. They took off smoothly, and the familiar jolt went through the ship, signaling they had left the atmosphere. Jen took a calming breath and opened the door to the cabin. Rad hadn't been lying. There was one bed, a chest of drawers, and a small bathroom with a shower and a toilet. Jen glanced at Rook. Could be worse, she commented, as her blush returned full force. I will take the floor, Rook offered. Jen shook her head. No need for that. This doesn't have to be awkward. It's only a 4-hour trip to Terminus 3. It's fine. Now, I don't know about you, but I need a nap, Jen stated, pulling off her shoes. Rook nodded as Jen flopped down onto the bed. I will go check in with Captain Dudesman and ensure we are on schedule. Jen shrugged and turned over. Rook nodded and set down his bag next to Jen's and headed off to the cockpit. Rad was speaking with his co-pilot, a bright pink AI system. It beeped loudly when Rook entered the room. Yeah, but they're paying plumbers. Rook couldn't understand the AI, but the tone of their beeps was less than flattering. Rad nodded slightly as Rook checked the course. They were headed in the right direction, and Rook nodded slightly. He'd admit he was pretty tired. He had stayed up several hours later than normal, wondering what Jen had thought about their date. He headed back to the cabin and smiled lightly. Jen was fast asleep, one hand under the pillow, snoring. It was loud and should have been obnoxious, but honestly, it was just so nice to see her relaxed. He'd never seen her like this before. Unconsciousness was different to peaceful sleep. He yawned. He really was quite tired. He laid down on the bed, as far away as he could from Jen, trying to respect her space. He sighed as he drifted off to sleep. Chapter 27, Rude Awakenings. The red lights and alarm blaring might have been the worst way to wake up, if it wasn't for the cold stone along his throat. He blinked as the feeling vanished. Jen had leapt away from him, her dagger clattering to the floor. Her eyes were still slightly blurred with sleep, and now the beginnings of tears. Before Rook could speak, she snatched up her knife and took off out the door. He was seconds behind her. He rounded the corner in time to spot Rad open fire at a large figure. Trouble? Rook asked, readying his prototool. Rad glanced at him. Trouble is my middle name. I thought your middle name was Prophet, Rook commented. A slight laugh from a few hallways down heralded Jen, and she wasn't alone. She was dragging a familiar Florana. Pax! The plant huffed loudly. He was wrapped in Spider Monkey's webbing. Jen avoided Rook's eyes, but neither of them had time to talk about what had happened back in their cabin when they discovered that Pax had snuck aboard to free the grackle flint, claiming it was wildly cruel to keep it in a cage. Never mind the damage it did to the lovely duck, or the fact that it tried and partially succeeded in eating the alien rights activist. They had just gotten the beast back under control when Rad's AI popped up babbling, or at least all Rook heard was babble. Jen, though, seemed to understand every word, which confused Rook. But before he could ask, Jen had yanked him behind a crate. Back where Pax and Rad stood, Rook could clearly hear a voice. Attention, alien vessel. This is Commander Raff of the Unstoppable Incursion Armada. You are suspiciously disabled within Incursion space. Prepare to be boarded and searched. The message cut out and Jen's eyes narrowed. She popped back around the crate. I have an idea. It's stupid. There's a very small chance of it working, and it's dangerous. Who's in? Rook nodded, laying a hand on her shoulder. Always. She smiled lightly. Rad cocked his gun. Danger is my middle name. Rook frowned at Rad, but Jen turned to Pax. You get to stick it to the incursions. The Florana grinned wide. Whoa, yeah, I'm in. Jen's grin had turned downright devious. Raph hadn't exactly had the best time over the last 4 months. Atea had ordered him and his division into the Null Void to discover if Vilgax had been transferred to that in Karsakon. He hadn't been, and Raph had lost a chunk of his men in the Void. When he'd finally escaped, he'd been informed that Atea had successfully staged a coup, with the possibly unwitting help of Gen 10, and overthrown her father. She now sat as Empress, and she had never liked him much. She'd assigned him to an outpost guarding a border. It was sort of an insult being sent so far away, but he'd been too close to her father to be kept close these days. He'd hoped to take out some aggression on this disabled ship, and now his men were running from a beast that had been on the ship. He had no choice. He called the ship back to tell them they could come get their creature. He gave the usual intro before he spotted who was on screen. Jennifer Tennyson sat in the pilot's seat, looking disinterestedly at her nails. Jen Tennyson, I might have known. Come get this beast. I'll let you into this sector. Just get this thing off my ship. Raph didn't care if he sounded panicked. He'd barricaded himself in a closet to get away from the Grackleflint. Jen let out a contemplative hum. Not good enough. I'll make you a deal, though. We take back the beastie, you let us through and back out without a fuss, and no one ever knows we were here, she offered, looking like she had all the time in the world. There was a bang at the closet door. Deal, just come get it off my ship. Deal. Rook had to say that he was impressed with his partner. She handled the situation like she'd done it 1,000 times. Raph kept his end of the bargain. They got to Terminus 3 with time to spare and easily located the downed plumber ship and its occupants. Only once they got them loaded onto the ship did Rook finally find a moment to confront Jen about what had happened. She was sitting in their shared cabin, looking over a datapad. Check it out. His name actually is Rad Prophet Danger Trouble Dudesman. She didn't look up at him. He frowned. Jen. She spoke again, still not looking at him. It's only happened once before, and I didn't have my dagger back then. He didn't interrupt, afraid she would stop explaining if he did. She never willingly talked about the past. Getting information out of her was akin to pulling teeth, except she was trained to resist torture. I already told you that Charmcaster and I had a fling. Well, it was very energetic, and I fell asleep with her. First time I'd ever done something like that. She let out a long breath. Sometimes, when I get woken up suddenly, or from a nightmare, I react like I'm being attacked. Because more than once, that's been the case. I ended up on top of her with my hands around her neck. Sort of like what happened a few hours ago. She and I never talked about it. Our relationship wasn't about stuff like that. She shrugged. Silence reigned. You have been through more than most anyone in the galaxy. It is only natural that you would have some trauma. Reactions like that are natural. She blinked up at him. You don't think... I do not think what? That it makes me weak? She looked away from him. He stepped up to her and gently tilted her chin up. It does not make you weak. It means you survived. More than anyone. It amazes me every time how strong you are. Jen's smile was slightly watery. The space between them seemed to be miraculously disappearing. Then the door opened, and one of the plumbers they had rescued blinked at them, clearing his throat. Sorry, Miss Tennyson. Magister Arnix wanted to talk to you. He stammered, and Jen sighed, her breath ghosting over Rook's face. It smelled slightly minty. She stood, pulling away from him with a slight smile. We'll come back to this. He nodded at her words as she disappeared. The plumber turned to him. Sorry, Rook sighed. You couldn't have picked a worse moment to interrupt. Rook stated almost under his breath, stalking away from the confused-looking plumber.